This program is supported by the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. The Cronkite School offers undergraduate and graduate degrees and other professional development opportunities for writers and storytellers. For more information, visit cronkite.asu.edu.
Welcome to WriteLane. This podcast features Tampa Bay Times Enterprise reporter Lane DeGregory, and my name is Maria Carrillo. I'm a former Enterprise editor at the Times, which helped us kick off this podcast in 2017. Now, it's being presented by the Poynter Institute and sponsored by the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. And the episodes this year will focus on some of the winners of the 2025 Poynter Journalism Prizes. As always, Lane and I want to go deeper on the subject of craft, so these episodes are geared toward exploring the reporting, the writing, and the editing behind this award-winning work. These podcasts will be available everywhere you listen to podcasts and on the Poynter Institute's YouTube channel. Joining us today is Dana Hedgpeth of The Washington Post. Dana and her colleagues won this year's Dory J. Maynard Justice Award for their 18-month investigation into the U.S. government's boarding schools for Native American children. Those children were not just torn from their families, many were killed, and many more were physically and sexually abused. Today's topic, history lessons. Dana, thanks for joining us. Let's start by talking about launching this project, which seems so incredibly daunting. You're covering a time period of 150 years. A lot of things that happened were not documented. Can you talk about the reporting and how did you even get to this story?
First off, thank you both so much for having me. It's a real honor and privilege. Knowing both of your backgrounds as outstanding journalists, I kind of chuckled again this morning when I read your bios again and thought, wow, they asked me. So very much an honor. I appreciate that. And thank you. And thank you for being a history lover, Maria. As you shared with me earlier, I too believe that we can only learn from our past to know where we're going. These are not old stories. These are very much stories that are very much still alive among Native Americans. I'm Native American. I'm from the Halawasa-Poni tribe of North Carolina. And so many Native people grow up knowing these oral histories and these stories, and they have reverberated the generations of this and the abuse and the trauma to generations today. And that's why these stories are so relevant. Just as a preface, I just want to say that it's not, history is so much, very much alive with these stories, and telling them is so very important. How did we come to this story? People often ask. I was very blessed that a colleague of mine, Sari Horwitz, good friend and colleague, outstanding Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the Washington Post, she was also interested in boarding schools, and we didn't know it. The Washington Post newsroom is so big that we were actually working on different teams. She started calling around, and I had been doing some work too, after talking to an editor of mine and said, I want to figure out how to tackle this subject. I was looking to try to find 4 to 5 survivors of these boarding schools to tell me intimately their experiences, because we're all getting older, right? And recording these stories, whether written or oral, is a part of Native American traditional storytelling. We are oral storytellers, and our histories are passed down orally. So I really wanted to find people who were first person, not just their descendants or their children or grandchildren retelling the stories, but really hearing from folks who had gone through these schools as far back as we could go. I was privileged to tell their stories and so honored, but finding those folks is a challenge. You're bringing up someone's past from long ago. It's often traumatic and hard. So and Sari was also working on some things. We decided two's better than one, and we started working together on a larger project. We have a philosophy of trying to start with the people you know, like a bullseye, put yourself in the middle and figure out, okay, who do you know? Indian country works very much, while it's large geographically, it's small. And who do you know and where do you come from and who are your people? So I started with a circle of folks to find out who do they know who are survivors and historians who've studied this, Native historians who've studied this, and then expanding that. And that's how we started with our reporting. Thankfully, once we started getting some traction, our editors became very interested in it and really equipped us with an incredible team. The power of working at a major newspaper is still very great, where you get all these amazing resources from the graphics department, from our forensic reporting team who could help with mapping, who spent extensive time, months, helping us find records. There are records out there. It's just a matter of literally digging. The National Archives have so many records, they're almost overwhelming. But I have some very good sources there who really helped to guide and direct us, to tell us where to look. And then we were able to set up sort of literally a system of how we all looked for records. We all took massive chunks of records and just found what we wanted and recorded it. So we set up standards so that everything was the same, and huge databases. And again, we had data reporters who were incredible at using AI tools, and then also just good old-fashioned reporting, honestly. Maria and Lane, you two know that best, of just looking and comparing. I'm not a very good cursive reader. I became one. The records are often written in cursive. They're scattered. They're incomplete at times. Tribal names are misspelled. Children's names are misspelled. And just digging and being consistent and sharing our information was really sort of how it started and came to be.
It sounds like it really exploded. I mean, from an initial goal of finding 4 or 5 survivors to tell you a personal narrative, how did you, or when did you make that turn into like, people are dead, people are being abused all over the place? How did it get so expansive? And when did you realize, okay, this is a lot more than an oral history about survivors?
Good question, Lane. I'm making it sound so easy. Hindsight's 2020. It's a challenge at a few speed bumps in there, as my mom would say. So I did that initial piece with my editor, Linda Robinson, on 4 people and telling their stories in sort of vignette style, short stories. And the trick was trying to make each one sound a bit different. I had a fabulous editor, Linda Robinson, best editors in American journalism by far, who really helped me vision that story. And then Sari and I
Linda Robinson. Let's just take a moment.
Let's take a moment.
I know her by reputation. Shout out to Linda Robinson. Go ahead.
Shout out to Linda Robinson. Love that, Maria. Another connection we have. Absolutely outstanding editor. And every story I've done on Native people, I'll just say here, in the last 11 years has been guided by Linda Robinson. She is outstanding. So we did that story. I did that story on my own. And then Sari and I realized we had a larger thing, exactly what you're talking about, Lane. And we realized, again, how to tackle these records. We started getting tips. And again, reaching out from our bullseye and hearing about lawsuits that have been filed in the Pacific Northwest. And those, as you know, paper documents, those are good, right? Journalists start licking their lips when you get papers and documents. The lawsuits were from years ago, but we started reaching out to those lawyers who'd been involved and saying, we'd like to talk to these folks who are involved in these lawsuits. And that was huge for the first piece we did on sexual abuse. We found that over 1,000 children we tracked had been sexually abused for a number of years by repeat offenders, and very much sad similarities that you saw, remember, in the Boston cases where young boys were being abused, where they would move priests around. And so that was like a piece of yarn string, right? You start pulling on that and one thing leads to another. And that's how we reported out that first big piece in the series that we did. And then we realized too, at one point during our reporting, I'm a history buff, fanatic, probably is the right word, on Native history. And I realized in working with my colleagues, I'm the only Native American in the newsroom. And I realized, hearing my colleagues, how they were relating to it, there was so much back history that folks didn't know. Very, very well-educated people I work with, so well-intentioned, throw their heart into everything. But Native American history, and trying to summarize that to a mainstream public quickly, I grappled. This is one of the hardest things we grappled with, was how to do that. I don't like leaving the history on the floor. And so we came up with this way, my partner and I, where we took all my geeky history, as they like to tease me, and we put it into like this timeline. And again, we had amazing designers who came up with this very interactive way to show that. And the headline of it was, they took the children. The beauty of it was, it didn't take away from that first piece on sexual abuse, because that was intense, right? And powerful, and had a lot of images and documents with it and the people. And then separately, we also gave people a a break to understand, like, how did this happen? So often I get that question from people. It's like, I never heard this in U.S. history classes. I never heard this growing up. I went to well-educated colleges and things, and they've never heard it. So I realized we need to do just one piece alone that gave the background and history of how this came about, going back to some of the founding fathers of this country saying things like educate the savages, and the Declaration of Independence calls native savages, and sort of putting things in context so that you could understand how this kind of policy comes about, where children can literally be forced or parents threatened if they don't send their kids away. And that helped so much. That was probably one of our best read pieces, because we got so many emails and comments from people saying, I was for years, I'm a retired history professor in Boston, and I never knew all the deep U.S. policies that had set up this program and problem.
We're going to take a break here for a moment, and then we'll be right back into the conversation with Dana.
As a journalist, what keeps you up at night? At Poynter, we understand the pressures, from shrinking resources to shifting audiences to tough ethical calls. Our expert trainers and coaches bring decades of experience to help you meet those challenges. We don't offer generic approaches. Poynter delivers strategies tailored to your needs, including training managers to lead high-performing teams, demystifying AI, and offering personal coaching to help move change forward or navigate a crisis. We work with news organizations large and small, local and national, commercial and nonprofit, as well as content creators and communicators in marketing and public relations. Let us help create the solution you need. Go to poynter.org/consulting-and-coaching today.
How much of your reporting and initial investigation into this project was inspired by what happened in Canada, when Canada actually acknowledged abuse and did something about it?
I don't like to jump on the bandwagon of news, I'll tell you. I think some of the best stories you find by watching and being there, and then you figure out a way to come back to it in a big way. That was a part of our reporting, but we didn't jump on that right away. We did day news stories, but what Sari and I were really trying to do was tell a larger story, a deeper story, and I think we did that, especially in our second piece. That the Canada was an impetus for Secretary Deb Haaland's work that she started, and that was a key impetus for many people to start coming out and telling their stories. So many victims we talked to and survivors said, when I saw that on TV, I picked up the phone and I called my grown child and said, I need to tell you what happened to me years ago. So that wasn't necessarily an impetus for us in our reporting, but so many survivors we talked to said that was a key turning point where people started realizing it was like the light switch went off, and they felt like it was coming into quote unquote mainstream, right? It was not just a Canada story, it became a US story. People didn't even realize that the US actually had the schools before Canada did, and Canada's were modeled on the US. So that was an eye opener for everybody, right? So in that sense, we were watching all that, but we had not launched at that time on our project. What we really wanted to do was go deep. So we took the report that Deb Haaland had done. She had started her work. Her team worked incredibly hard to produce an incredible 2 reports that the reason they were incredible is that for the first time, you have a Native American cabinet level secretary turning an inward look. Her department, the Interior Department, was the very department that created and was in charge of these schools. And for her, the story was so personal. Her relatives, her grandparents had gone to these schools. So just imagine, she's turning the spotlight on her very own department. And her conclusions were, there was huge wrongdoings. These schools were wrong. I always say there is no more forceful, harsh way than to ruin a culture and a people than to take their children. Okay? Whether you're purple, white, black, polka dot, or striped. There's nothing we all prize more than the next generation and our children. I run hot and get chills every time I say that. You two are mothers. You can relate and you understand. When you take someone's child or forcibly take or threaten to take their child, you are crushing a people. And so we wanted to really dig deep into that. And our story on the deaths really got at that. We took the work that Haaland's team did. They found about 900 children had died at these Indian boarding schools, and we dug deeper. And again, we had incredibly talented team of people that helped us dig. And we found 3,100 children had died at these schools. And again, our amazingly talented team of graphic designers, they heard us in our reporting. And I feel passionate, as you can tell, about this. And they kind of took my more gummy thoughts, I would say, and they had a vision for it. And their vision was that they took every one of those children, got a little figure, and online and in print. And if we had the child's name, we put it underneath it. That was so powerful to our readers. I can not tell you how many emails and notes I got from both Native and non-Native readers of the vision to imagine 3,104 children being killed. When you are scrolling through and those little figures are scrolling beside you, it gives you a sense of how many is 3,104, right? That's more fingers and toes than I can count. But when you can see it and the names keep popping up and the figures, it gives you a sense. My very good friend, Kathy Bayard, formerly of the Post, who is also Native, she and I chuckled. She said, we both agreed when the story ran in print on several full pages. And I said, I don't think the Washington Post has ever had this many Native American names in its pages in its 100-plus-year history. That was a statement of the Post of how much our editors cared about telling this story and the resources and the passion that they shared of letting people know, because so many people didn't know. And we found 3 times as many children died in the federal government, and they had spent 3 years on their investigation.
Yeah. You've touched on the whole idea of revisiting history, and I want to come back to that a little bit because, there's some folks here now in this country, including the president, who doesn't want us. They don't want us to focus on our bad history, things like slavery, what we did to Native Americans. But you obviously feel like, wow, this is an untold story, right? It's an untold story, and you've got older people who are now seniors who actually lived it. So we're running out of time to tell their stories. I just wonder kind of how do you answer that question? Why is it worth it?
Oh, history, we learn from our history, and history is messy and ugly. That doesn't mean we should run for it. I've talked a lot about this project because you can tell I feel passionate. And a couple months ago, I talked to a retired group of teachers, and she said, well, what do you say, Dana, to a white child who says you're making me feel bad at my history? And I paused for a moment and I looked to the organizers and said, wow, that's a tough one. You didn't tell me the questions were going to be so tough. But I thanked her for that question on the spot. And my answer was something like, we don't tell history to make people feel badly. We tell history to learn from it. Just because something is ugly or messy, it doesn't mean it's not the truth. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. And we should respect each other's truth. We might not like it. It is going to make us feel uncomfortable. It is going to make us choke on our Thanksgiving turkey dinner, as it should, as it should. Because if you do nothing else, some of the most powerful and wonderful emails I have gotten are people who said, you ruined my day with your story because you made me think about the past and about the history and examine what I know or thought I knew and was wrong. Those are the best emails I get because while it made you feel uncomfortable, you read it. I got a couple seconds, hopefully minutes, for you to read my story and just to pause for a moment and just think whether you knew it or you thought you knew it incorrectly. Education of history is a beautiful thing, no matter how ugly. And I just obviously passionately believe that. While painful, absolutely. Ugly, absolutely. Terrible, heartfelt, absolutely. But that doesn't mean we should stop telling these stories. I just this week, September 30th is the National Day of Remembrance for Native American boarding school survivors and those who didn't make it home. This week I was in an event on Capitol Hill. They did it a little early because a lot of Native leaders were in town. And Ramona Klein, who was an incredible woman who went to Fort Totten Indian boarding school, stood. And Ramona, I think she's probably in her 70s, but she looks like she's in her 50s. She's fantastic. And she had a young boy from the crowd who was 8 years old stand with her. And little Floyd, I'll try not to fall into a puddle telling this story, but she said, this is how old I was when I was taken from my home.
Jeez.
Okay. He had an older brother. His family was there. They live in Rockville. They're originally from North Dakota. And when I came home, I was her brother's age. That gap in time is incredible, right? Ramona has become an advocate in a way in her life. She is amazing of sharing her story of being mentally, physically, sexually abused at a boarding school, but her strength is just incredible. If you are not impressed with Ramona Klein, then you don't have blood in your body, I would say, because every time I've heard her speak several times, but every time she's phenomenal, and her story will catch you. It'll take your breath away, as my dad would say, because she tells it with such passion. Those stories, as you say, Maria, they're part of history. They're a living history. They're relevant. Okay, how Ramona persevered through that, how she raised her children, how she became a PhD. That is an incredible story. That's nothing but readers. How could you not want to hear that story? To me, she's a fascinating person, and there's so many like her who are humbled but willing to share their stories now. And for Mona, that's almost a form of therapy, I think, to share her story. I've met other boarding school survivors. Dora Broadplenty, I got to know. She's incredible, and she is a great artist, but she was punished in boarding school for, quote, doodling. Turns out as Ramona got older, she started doing her, quote, doodling, and she does great drawings and paintings, and she does sewing, and she makes this Native American clothing that can be worn every day. And often when I give a speech, I wear a dress that she made. Why does Ramona do that? Because that's her therapy, because those are things that she couldn't do when she was young. She could not express her culture. So for her to have young people in her tribe wear that in fashion shows, that's power. It's power. That's what our culture is all about, is learning from the past of what those went before us went through. And to see Ramona, to see Dora Broadplenty smile when their stories are heard, there's nothing richer than people being able to learn from that. So that, as many folks say, so that it may never happen again. We should all learn from that. And that's why I feel it's so important to share these stories. And it is relevant now because our story about deaths, we took an epic journey going from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where the first Native American boarding school was started by Richard Pratt, who famously said, "Kill the Indian in him, save the man." That pretty much says it all of how he thought about educating, quote unquote, educating Indians. We were blessed that the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation let us go with them as they exhumed 3 of their loved ones who had died there at that school. That was incredible, to literally sit with them in a cemetery for 3 days as archaeologists carefully exhumed those bones, bone by bone. They pulled them out. We rode in a caravan with them, following them across the country to Montana, 30 miles from the Canadian border on that journey. Some of us got COVID, including me. They held prayer ceremonies. They smudged along the way. They got to Fort Peck, once one of the rival tribes back in the day, who stood lining the reservation road as we came in. The truck carrying the remains broke down. By the time I got to Fort Peck, these small little coffins were in a U-Haul truck. Sadly, that was all we could find to rent. They could find. The fact that a rival tribe stood on the side of the road to welcome and say, "Welcome home," to these children. Almeda Heavyhair was our main character, who, to see those children learning of their history was an incredible moment. When we got back that night to the Fort Belknap Reservation, finally, I was riding with the chairman of the Fort Belknap tribe. Very, as my mother would say, a Hollywood Indian, an Indian-looking Indian. Broad chest, long hair, good looking, the Robert Redford of Indians. And he could be pretty stoic, quiet, very, very smart, always thinking. And I looked at him in the rearview mirror, and he had tears in his eyes. Okay, because there was hundreds of cars waiting for us. We were hours late because of car troubles. They were waiting for us to do a caravan to the high school where they had set up, as non-natives call them, to set up teepees and to do an all-night wake for those 3 young children who had died so far from home. I will never forget their medicine men saying, "Leave that dirt here," at Carlisle when the U.S. Army said, "Would you like to take some of the dirt with them?" And you know what they said? They're going home. They're going home. There is nothing more important and sacred to Native Americans than to be buried on their homeland. 100 plus years later, to have those young people exhumed, they had been taken by train to a place that was totally foreign to them, and to follow them on that journey, there was no better way to tell that story of why this is relevant in the present, and to experience that, than to go on that journey and to rebury them on a gorgeous hilltop in the Montana sky, big sky country, on a perfect windswept day. Blue clouds, sunny skies, they were home. That history is so important. There were young kids there playing, helping to place rocks around their graves. And our culture, we include everyone so that they may know and learn from it. We go on their shoulders. There's nothing more important than everyone knowing their personal history. And to witness that, we were so blessed and privileged, and to be able to share that story, it was just a powerful way to close out of what had happened to 3,100 children, even though it was long ago.
Hey, great segue to something I wanted to touch on. I think so many young journalists that I talk to are very worried about re-traumatizing people or making them open up wounds that have been closed or ignored or not even known about, as you referenced. But yet, a lot of it seems also, when you reach the elder people who have gone through this, that it becomes cathartic in a way. Can you talk about that a little bit, about the reaction from the people who you kind of made reopen these horrible histories, and how that affected them and you?
You're definitely right. You do need to be sensitive to that. And one of the things we did when we started out is to talk to people who are experts in dealing in trauma and educate ourselves. Before you ever reach out to the first survivor, you have to educate yourself on whatever particular trauma you're dealing with, and talk to an expert and say, this is what I'm trying to do, and what should I be aware of? I am not a trained counselor or psychologist or therapist. I don't play one on TV. And all jokes aside, it's serious business when you're asking people very personal things. So we talked to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, NABS for short, and got their advice of how do we go about this. They were incredibly helpful, professional. They deal with this every day, of getting folks to tell their stories. They're doing a huge oral history project. You do have to be aware of that. One thing to do is, just like any good journalist is, we're all humans, right? Find a way to connect. Donald Nakoni, who was a survivor of, we used one of his quotes in a headline, 12 years of hell, which I don't need to say anything more, summarized his experience at Riverside Boarding School in Oklahoma. His story was perhaps the cruelest, because he was only about 4 or 5 miles from his parents' home. They could only visit him from the roadside fence. That gives me chills, knowing that you can only see your child from afar. And the kids were so fearful they would run away. Donald had never talked about his time there, but I saw that he had testified at a Deb Haaland event when she did a thing called Road to Healing across the country. She went to several stops in Indian country, and she just sat there. She and her assistant secretary, Brian Nolan, just sat and listened to people's stories. She didn't make a big speech. She's Native, right? She's Pueblo Laguna. As my mother would say, she's 100% Native at heart, because that's what you do, is you sit and listen. And so I think that's the key, Lane, is that you listen. I think so often we in this world, and as journalists, we're ready to hurry. We're always on deadline. But if you show people the respect and the time, they want to tell their story. Donald and I would have long conversations by phone or sometimes by Zoom. He'd call me at night. I'd call him on walks. He lived in Washington at one point. I called him when I'd be out walking, take pictures of the cherry blossoms. We mixed it up. We got to know each other as people and humans, instead of me always trying to get information from him and take him to those traumatic places. We developed a trust and a relationship where there was, I'll never forget, one night I was lying on my couch at about 10:30 my time. We were just chit-chatting, shooting it. He says, I got to tell you something I never told my wife. And I said, I better get up off the couch. Hold on a second.
Sure.
I didn't have a pen and paper. I was laying down. I told him, I said, I got a headache. And that's where it got real. That's where we started getting deep. Okay. And so you build that relationship. You show the respect. Indians always joke that we're always running late. We run on Indian time. My colleagues, I always tease them, you're welcome to sit in on an interview, but when I'm talking to a Native person, I got nothing but time. Mm-hmm. I usually try to do my interviews in about 30 minutes. I have a attention span about as long as my pinky, very short. But I get myself into that mode where you're talking to a tribal elder. They don't call it an interview. They say, come visit with me. And when someone says, come visit, that's a magic word of you got nothing but time. My phone goes off and you listen and you let them set the cadence. They are setting the cadence, and you will get a feel when someone is talking about trauma when they're ready to tell you. I never say to somebody, take me to the most traumatic moment. It just sort of comes naturally. It's a strange thing, but it's also showing them huge respect. When we go to those dark sides, I do break it up by saying, who is around you or who can you call when we're done to get some support? I do a lot of my interviews by phone or by Zoom before I actually go see someone. Donald Oconee, I spent months getting to know him, and he said he never wanted to meet me in person. We needed to get a photo of him, and Linda Robinson said, you'll have to go with the photographer. And I said, the magic might be gone once he meets me in person. It could be terrible. I went to Anadarko, Oklahoma, not that easy to get to, knocked on his door, and I was shaking like a leaf. And his wife peeked out the window. He opened the door, and I thought, is he going to slam the door and invite me in? That was early afternoon. I left his house late that evening. Nothing but time. We had built the relationship, and he took me to his tribal grounds, he and his son, Donald with his walker, his wife. Donald started singing in his own language. There's nothing more powerful to hear. He's one of a handful of Kiowa speakers still alive who speaks his own language fluently. Sitting under those pine trees with Donald. When I left that evening, dark, 9:00, I remember the moon. I remember stopping at a gas station and recording by myself just how powerful and how special it was that Donald had opened up his life story to me. And his wife, she hugged me and said, I heard things from him today that I've never heard. She sometimes had to get up and go in another room. Okay? You don't just drop into somebody, parachute in on that. You build it. It does take time, and it takes patience, and it takes really listening. And it takes talking about dogwoods and talking about kids and talking about, you get reflective as you get older in life, right? Donald is now in his 80s, and he says, I look back, so much of how he raised his children was impacted, sadly, by his boarding school. He and I still talk a couple times a month, and every time I talk to him, I always say, Donald, I love you. And he laughs, and he says, you know how hard it is for me to say that? I said, I know, but come on, give me some, tell me. And you know what he says about that? He says, no one ever told me I love you when I was growing up at a boarding school. Okay, so connecting with people, you have to put in the time and listen to them, and you'll be surprised at what you'll get. Sharing just funny stories about, animals or other things. You build those kinds of relationships with people to balance it out. I'm not saying that you do that to joke of their trauma or things at all. But people need to trust you to go to those dark places. And you always make sure that they have a support system to follow up with, so that they are getting the help that they need, that you're not just leaving them after you hang up the call or you leave their home. That's very important. That's one of the things I learned from the NABS counselors, to make sure that they have a way to kind of debrief themselves, because I'm not equipped to do that, right? But make sure they have some kind of support network that makes them feel comfortable.
Last question. You kind of touched upon this a little bit, but what has been the reaction to the project, both from people who were in it and from readers? It's
all been very positive, thankfully, in that people have been shocked, saddened, surprised. Some people have said, I'm a very well-educated person. I've been to have several degrees, and I didn't know of this history or realize it. That's probably one of the repeat comments we've gotten, versions of that from people. From those who were in it, powerful. James LaBelle was in a few of our stories. He's Alaska Native. I just saw him this week. I had the pleasure of seeing him and his wife. Seeing Mr. LaBelle in Phoenix when President Biden gave that apology. The first time a U.S. president has acknowledged and apologized. And he said, I apologize, I apologize, I apologize. Every time I see Mr. LaBelle, we say that over and over again. Because for him, who's also in his 70s, to live to that moment was powerful, and he got to be there. His daughter came up to me in Phoenix and hugged me. I had never met her. She said, you got my dad to talk about things that we'd never heard. I had other people who were young, who were in their 30s, Native journalists, and folks who weren't journalists, who would write me and say, I saw my grandmother's name on that screen, and I knew she had gone to a school. we did a GitHub where we had found the sourcing for all the material we had, and people thanking us of saying, I couldn't follow the paper trail and find it. You gave me a hook. I had people come up to, I was at an event, like I said, this week, someone came up to me, works in gaming association, and said, hey, are you the boarding school girl? I said, maybe. And he said, I want to send you a name. What do you have on my great grandmother? She would talk very little about that. That information, again, is powerful. These records, they're out there. They're hard to find. They can be intimidating. There's thousands of them. And to just give people a little bit of validation, I think, is what meant so much. We had so many people in the story who said, you listen and you validated what happened to me. That's huge. That's huge. And that is sort of, I think, the most powerful reaction, the best reaction that we could have gotten is to share that. Even for my own children, who are 11 and 13 now, to see that recognized again in a major newspaper, the Washington Post, right? That says something. How you interpret that, that's all on that. Each person interprets it differently, right? But for me, that's saying this is validation of a dark chapter, often forgotten and sometimes unknown in American history, that should not be swept under the rug. It should be told. It should be told in a careful, accurate, and thoughtful way, because it will resonate with people whether you are Native or not. And as my mother says, all we can do is lay it on the table. My job is to lay it on the table. How you take from it, that's on you. But we laid it on the table.
I like that. We'll end on your mother's note. So, Dana, thank you so much. It's been fascinating listening to you. And obviously, you're such a gifted storyteller, because even just listening to you tell the story of getting the story was so compelling. Thanks for all of you guys who are listening. Thanks again to Arizona State and Poynter. The 2026 Poynter Journalism Prizes open for entries on January 5th, so mark your calendars. Don't forget, you can find old episodes on poynter.org/WriteLane and wherever you get your podcasts. Please join our Facebook group if you'd like to be notified when new episodes appear, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'd love a nice review too. I was told I had to pimp that. This podcast was produced by Dalia Colon, the amazing Dalia Colon. Technical support was provided by Sam Posnack, who's also amazing. He works here at Poynter. Music was composed and performed by Dan DeGregory.